Welcome to History's Influence. Japan is often compared to the West for its similarities in its history, rapid adoption of Western technology, and its own imitations of Western architecture, machinery, and media. However, one element of Western civilization Japan never embraced was Christianity. But this wasn't destined to be the case. Christianity had seen initial success when first introduced to Japan, but it was persecuted and eventually banned in the country. But what if Japan had embraced Christianity rather than rejecting it? What would have happened to have allowed this to occur? What would be the repercussions for Japan, both internally and externally? All these questions and more will be answered in this alternate history. Let's first discuss the religious landscape of Japan before the introduction of Christianity. The two major religions of Japan were Shintoism and Buddhism. Shintoism was the indigenous religion of Japan, arriving with the Yayoi, descendants of the modern Japanese people, somewhere around 700 BC to 300 BC. The religion focuses upon supernatural spirits which inhabit the world, called kami, either in objects or inhabit concepts like luck or fertility. Shinto holds an emphasis on living in harmony with both the physical and spiritual realms, connecting, honouring and appeasing the kami, alongside a focus on ancestor worship, including family shrines and altars to honour their dead. Buddhism, originally from India, came into Japan by the 500s at the latest. Buddhism focuses on the nature of human suffering, the possible liberation from said suffering, and the path to do so. Compared to Western religions, it's more of a philosophy as opposed to a dogmatic religion, with various schools of Buddhist thought present within Japan. Buddhism had merged with Shintoism to create a syncretic blend of the two faiths. The merging of these two religions is known as Shimbutsu Shugo. Now let's look at Japanese history during the initial arrival of Christianity. We're going to look at Japan in the 1500s and early 1600s. This period, known as the Sengoku period, was rife with infighting and a weak shogunate, and an even weaker figurehead emperor. You see, the Emperor of Japan used to be a strong leader centuries before this, but over time, centralized control had weakened, leading to the prevalence of samurai mercenaries by the 1100s who would protect wealthy landowners. They eventually became a power base in their own right, establishing a shogunate, with the samurai shogun exercising political authority and power, but pledging allegiance to the figurehead emperor. The other samurai landholders, who were beholden to the shogun, were known as daimyos. The Ashikaga shogunate was the second major shogunate of Japanese history, but by the 1500s, it was weak and struggled to exercise political control. The daimyo as a result became much more autonomous. Oda Nobunaga was the leader of the Oda clan and was a daimyo himself. Why do we mention him? He was an ambitious leader who conquered and unified most of Japan under his clan's control, finally dissolving the weak Ashikaga shogunate in 1573. He is known as the first great unifier of Japan in this period. During his career, starting in 1549, Christian daimyos began to arise in southern Japan due to the Spanish and Portuguese arriving, with the Catholic Holy Order of the Jesuits spreading Catholicism to the Japanese. A focus on a top-down process of conversion was present, with the missionaries preferring to convert daimyos rather than peasants, and attempting to convert the shogun and emperor. Oda Nobunaga was lenient towards Christianity and allowed the Jesuits to spread the religion, not believing it to be a threat to his rule. Unexpectedly, one of Oda's underlings had betrayed him with an ambush, forcing him to commit seppuku, a samurai form of ritual suicide. His successor was Toyotomi Hideyoshi, a loyal subject of his, from the Toyotomi clan. He continued his project of the unification of Japan, albeit under a new clan. Toyotomi began a harsher policy towards Christians, banning the religion and ordering his subjects to renounce the faith. In 1597, Hideyoshi had been informed of a Spanish shipwreck, whose surviving pilot informed the Japanese that the Spanish had planned to invade Japan, using missionary work as an infiltration method. This led to the martyrdom of 26 Christians in Nagasaki, followed with further persecution. Hideyoshi had also attempted to invade Korea and China with an invasion force of over 300,000 men over 2 invasion waves, but he was beat by the Joseon dynasty of Korea and the Ming dynasty of China. Hideyoshi died of natural causes, and his successor was too young and required a regency. During this period, the persecution of Christianity was eased. This gave the ambitious and powerful third unifier, Tokugawa Ieyasu, the opportunity to unify Japan under his own Tokugawa clan. His initial power base was in the eastern side of Japan. He faced opposition with the western side of Japan, who were still loyal to the Toyotomi. So in 1600, his forces met the loyalists at the Battle of Sekigahara, and they won the battle. The western forces were fairly disunited and had defections before and during battle. This makes sense given their lack of strong leadership. After this victory, the Tokugawa shogunate was established, ruling Japan for over 250 years, in a period of strict isolation from the outside world, with internal peace and prosperity. Christianity was outlawed, persecution, exile, and internal deportations occurred. The famous Shimabara Rebellion in 1637 to 1638 was the last major instance of Christian resistance in Japan. Many Christians soon went into hiding, becoming the more syncretic and heretical hidden Christians, fading into obscurity. After the Meiji Restoration in 1868, the emperor was restored to his position of authority, and the country had ended its lengthy period of isolation. However, the damage was done, and Christianity remains a very small part of Japan today. Most timelines I've seen on this topic will use the Shimabara Rebellion as the point of departure, having a rebellion victory and Christian political power following soon after, or at least having the religion be tolerated in Japan. Instead, we're going to go for a different route. We will change the outcome of the Battle of Sekigahara, with the Western forces winning the battle against the Eastern forces. Whilst it's true the Western forces weren't as unified or effective as the Eastern, I don't think it's unfeasible to say they could have won the battle, which wasn't a clear landslide from the onset. In particular, if early wins occur in the battle, the Western forces are less likely to defect, helping keep the battle in favour of the West in this more advantageous situation. However, even with a victory, the Western forces will continue to be disunited and will fragment, with the Eastern side already broken from the battle itself as well, leaving Japan with a power vacuum for a potential unifier. Our point of departure will involve a lesser known figure of the time, Oda Nobunaga's grandson, Oda Hidenobu. The Oda clan was weakened when he came to power, and Hidenobu was chosen to lead the clan by the second unifier, to help weaken his family members as potential rivals. The main reason we're going to focus on Oda Hidenobu is that he was a Catholic. Additionally, despite the word of his advisors who wanted him to remain loyal to the Eastern forces, he decided to side with the Western forces at the Battle of Sekigahara, who utilized his important Gifu castle. We don't know much of Hidenobu's personality, so for the sake of this new timeline, we're going to assume he can act as an ambitious unifying figure, treating him as a person similar to his grandfather. We're going to assume his independent decision to join the Western forces won't be his last independent decision. In this new timeline, Oda Hidenobu will gradually develop more influence and be able to assert Oda primacy yet again, in this new unstable environment we've created. He will navigate the tense and divided Western and Eastern forces, growing a large power base. The second unifier of Japan had peasant origins, so I don't think it's unrealistic to say Hidenobu, with his strategic Gifu castle and Oda clan name, would be unable to unify Japan himself. Since Japan would be more divided, it would take longer for Oda to unite Japan, completing the job of the first two unifiers. Being in his 20s, he would have ample time, coincidentally around the same age his grandfather was when he began his campaigns of unification. Hidenobu would downplay his Christianity initially, due to concerns about the subversive nature of the religion, which led to its persecution during this period in our own timeline. But it's important to note that the gap between the second unifier holding power and the third unifier holding power saw a brief respite of Christian tolerance occurring. Oda's legitimacy through his clan, strong leadership abilities, general cunning, and impressive accumulation of power will further help outweigh this concern. He would also refuse European aid in order to prevent being seen as an agent of foreign interests. He would likely appeal to the Christian and Christian sympathetic daimyos in the south, however, who would serve as a strong element of his new power base. It's possible that he may be assassinated or some group against him forms due to his Christian nature, but we will assume for the reasons above and his competency that he does not fall victim to such plotting. The capital of the Oda shogunate won't be placed in Tokyo in this new timeline. Edo, later known as Tokyo, was an appropriate capital for the Tokugawa shogunate in our timeline, allowing the new regime's power center to be isolated from the large central cities of Osaka and Kyoto, instead being closer to the east, the location of their initial support base. The castle of Gifu would seem the obvious choice in this new timeline, but I'd argue Oda would instead move the capital to Osaka, a large coastal city. It's in a centralized location and near the ceremonial capital of Kyoto, which was the location of the emperor, which is practical. It would also keep leadership closer to the Christian support base in the south, allowing for easier access to trade with European Christians. A potential existential threat the Japanese would have to face is an invasion by the Spanish or other Europeans. The Society of Jesus, a Catholic religious order, pushed for an invasion of Japan heavily. However, with the Spanish Armada being defeated in 1588 at the hands of the British, plans for the invasion were scrapped, alongside Spain's ambitious plan to invade China. I don't believe an invasion of Japan would have been feasible. Japan in this period was heavily militarized and could exert strong unified force, like with their attempted invasions of Korea. I don't believe a distant Spain, whose closest colony was the Philippines, which was only reached by the Spanish through Mexico, would be able to invade Japan in any realistic manner. The Portuguese weren't interested in the invasion, and were under the rule of the Spanish king at this point. It's also important to note that the British and Dutch were trading in Japan at the time. However, they weren't focused on missionary work or conquest, simply trade. This is why during Japan's period of isolation in our own timeline, the Dutch were allowed to trade within Dejimi and Nagasaki. They wouldn't be seen as a threat by the Japanese. Regardless of the infeasibility of a European invasion, Hidenobu will legalize Christianity under Japanese terms and regulate how European missionaries would proselytize the religion. This would keep internal factions concerned about the negative Western influence or invasion at bay. They would see the religion subdued by power by the new shogun, whose own Christian beliefs didn't undermine the importance of Japanese sovereignty and unification. In our own timeline, Oda Hidenobu sponsored and supported Buddhist temples despite being Christian. So I believe during his reign as shogun, he will maintain this similar tolerance of traditional Japanese religion, not desecrating their buildings or insulting their followers. This would further put concerns at ease. The Italian Jesuit, Alessandro Valignano in our own timeline, emphasized the mass propagation of the religion, whilst being tolerant of certain doctrinal misunderstandings on the part of the Japanese. This would help aid in the proselytization process. It would be too bold a move to adopt Catholicism as the official religion of Japan at this stage, however. But we would expect many of the elites to follow suit with Hidenobu and adopt Christianity, causing Osaka to become a hotbed for Christianity. Many daimyo through the country would do this in order to ingratiate themselves with the shogun as well, in turn converting their own retainers and peasants. The approach of the European missionaries was always to focus on top-down conversion, so this will continue to occur, meaning that the daimyo would have upwards shogun pressure, but also downwards missionary pressure to convert to the religion. We're going to assume that Oda Hidenobu lives at least to his 60s, to ensure that his particular policies have a long-term effect on the country. Although the same can still occur if his successors are seen as legitimate and continue his Christian policies, even if he dies relatively young. Looking at our own timeline, in 1603, Japan had 300,000 Christians, and in the 1630s, they had 760,000 despite state persecution. Japan's population is estimated to have been around 15 to 17 million in the early 1600s, meaning Christians went from 2% to 4% of the country in this time frame, despite state persecution at the time. We're going to see a much larger increase in this new timeline as a result. I would estimate Japan would be about 10% Christian by the 1630s at least, with exponential growth following that time. 10% is often the tipping point of members of a group adopting a new practice, so we will expect exponential growth of Christianity henceforth. Examples would be Christianity within the Roman Empire or communism within Russia and later the Soviet Union in terms of this 10% tipping point. One of Hidenobu's successors, likely his son or grandson, with Catholicism becoming a predominant religion, will eventually adopt Christianity as the official religion of Japan. The Emperor of Japan, at this point a Shinto religious figurehead, will adopt Catholicism under the pressure of the shogun, or perhaps out of genuine desire. This would be a very big deal in the solidification of Christianity within Japanese society. Delegates from the Pope will be officially sent to the country to ensure proper Christianization. They will also ensure that administration and practices within the country are Christian, ensuring the religion stays truly Catholic within the country. Buddhists and Shintoists would become severely outnumbered over time and will likely be persecuted after the official adoption of Christianity. But I don't believe the Japanese would make a total break from their beliefs or the cultural elements of these religions contributed to Japan. For example, Buddhist and Shinto temples will likely be converted to churches and other Christian buildings, preserving the architecture of their ancestors. Speaking of ancestors, ancestor worship will be maintained in a more Christian-friendly form, with veneration as opposed to literal worship, compared to how Catholics venerate saints. Perhaps a decree will be issued by the emperor or shogun, stating that the adoption of Catholicism will ensure your ancestors are also saved by Jesus, despite this not really following with true Catholic teachings. Certain Japanese festivals may also be appropriated into Christian form, with contradictions ignored, or perhaps just performed regularly but without that same religious context. For example, there's the Bon Festival, which honours the spirit of ancestors, or the Setsuban, which marks the beginning of a spring with throwing roasted soybeans to drive away evil spirits. Death Day in Mexico would be a good example of this pagan syncretism within Catholicism. Even though it's dubious whether it comes from native or European customs, Death Day is clearly a syncretic holiday, not reflective of traditional Christian beliefs. The reincarnation elements of Buddhism will be phased out, however, or they will be irreparably warped into the theme of eternal life through Jesus. The kami spirits being everywhere will be phased out too as a belief, but the contradicting holidays from this original religion will still exist most likely, at least to a smaller extent. And obviously Christian holidays such as Christmas and Easter will now be celebrated. On the topic of Christmas, Christmas is actually celebrated in Japan in our own timeline, but in a secular fashion. They hold this tradition of eating KFC on Christmas Eve, which is kind of interesting. Also, 70% of Japanese weddings are Christian weddings, despite most Japanese people not actually being Christian. Anyway, I digress. Japan would prosper economically due to internal stability, like the isolated Tokugawa shogunate in our timeline, but this effect would be increased with open trade. Instead of learning from the West through Dutch materials in two port cities, the entirety of Japan, particularly the coastal capital of Osaka, will now have access to Western knowledge and technology, allowing for the Japanese to remain closer to the levels of advancement the Europeans would reach. Western education and philosophy is going to be integrated syncretically with prior Japanese beliefs. Japanese art and architecture is likely to incorporate Christian elements, particularly from the Spanish and Portuguese. Imagine Spanish colonial architectural elements fusing with Shinto-style buildings. This could be possible. Poetry, literature and the like will likely take more inspiration from the European Christian sources as well. Most samurai would transition into administration of various sorts, as they did with the Tokugawa shogunate, still becoming a more peaceful ruling elite under the Oda shoguns. Perhaps the confiscation of weapons within Japan will still happen in this timeline, but they would be permitted outside of Japan. I would expect military divisions initially under samurai control to be used as colonial armies, however. In our timeline, the American naval officer Matthew C. Perry, using a show of strength with his technologically advanced gunboats, was able to pressure Japan and force them to open up to foreign trade, ending their period of isolation. In this new timeline, the Japanese aren't going to be shocked by such technology, and would already have trade agreements with America in the first place. So this wouldn't collapse the Oda regime as it did for the isolationist Tokugawa. But perhaps Japan faces new existential issues that requires regime change. Or it could just be that the shogun system becomes outdated and is thereby abolished for some sort of constitutional monarchy with a figurehead emperor, like the UK sort of thing, or how Japan in the modern day functions. Would Japan be an outwards colonising force, or would they not bother with colonial ambitions? In our timeline, the Japanese invaded Ryukyu in the early 1600s and established them as a tributary state. But the Japanese only ruled the island themselves after their period of isolation, which happened about 250 years afterwards. The northern island of Hokkaido only saw serious expansion after the isolation period ended as well. The same was the case for the conquest of Korea. But there's three main factors that indicate the Japanese would act differently in this timeline. They wouldn't be in a period of isolation, meaning the aforementioned areas they conquered will likely be acquired earlier. They will be adopting European technology and concepts earlier, giving them the capability to explore and colonize distant lands, and would also have clear examples to follow of this being done by the Europeans to great wealth and success. They will be following a religion which encourages its own propagation, giving them more incentive to conquer lands and convert their inhabitants. I would argue that for these reasons, Japan will be colonizing its surrounding regions, and even more distant regions. Because they'll be starting much earlier, Japan won't feel a need to overcompensate with European colonialism as they did in World War II, which led to their extremist fervour and also the implosion of their empire. Let's discuss the areas Japan will colonize and conquer. The most obvious candidate for conquest would be Korea. The failed invasions of 1592 to 1598 from the Second Unifier would have already happened in this timeline, but a period of isolation wouldn't be present. The strength and technology gap with the Qing dynasty of China, who ruled Korea as a tributary state in this period, would determine when Japan will take the region. I believe by the 1700s, the Japanese would be advanced enough to face the Qing and win in Korea. Remember that the Japanese still pulled off considerable victories during the Second Unifier's invasions, and would have learned lessons from their failures in regards to supply lines and such. Korea was too populous and civilizationally advanced to be fully assimilated by the Japanese. They're going to remain Korean. However, assuming an early conquest, we'll expect to see a larger Christian and Japanese influence in their country that would become a permanent feature, with Korea becoming a Christian nation in the long run. The Japanese would still wish to conquer China. However, with such a large-scale invasion, it would be unrealistic, even given the technology gap that will widen between the Japanese and Chinese over time. During China's weak state against the Europeans, named the Century of Humiliation, which started in 1839, we could see Japan gain land in Manchuria. They will compete with the Russians for this land, however, but I'd expect them to keep the majority of it, given its proximity to Korea and mainland Japan. I believe they would attempt to Christianize the region too, and be fairly successful. However, they would not be able to compete with Russia in the far reaches of Siberia and Alaska in their firm push eastwards. The unappealing terrain of these regions will also discourage Japanese attempts of colonization. Taiwan during the mid-1600s did not have a heavy Chinese presence yet, so I would expect the Japanese, with their superior naval technology and will to colonize, to take the island for themselves early, with Japanese people settling the island and becoming the majority population. I believe the island of Sakhalin, above Hokkaido, will also be colonized in this timeline. It held a presence of Ainu natives, the same group on Hokkaido, so it only makes sense for the Japanese to extend their reach here. I believe most of the Pacific Islands, habited or uninhabited, will come under Japanese rule, and with their low populations, will easily be assimilated or populated with Japanese people. The Europeans will be too late by the 1800s to acquire such islands, as they did in our timeline. The early conquest of Hawaii will cause the USA to feel more threatened by Japan than in our timeline, which could lead to tensions and a Pacific rivalry. The area from around Seattle to California may be appealing to Japan, from their base in Hawaii. The Spanish first settled a permanent Californian settlement in 1769. If the Japanese are able to colonize these areas earlier and find gold in California, a substantial Japanese presence will form here. If not, the regions are likely to be ignored, or eventually revert to the historical owners due to too little Japanese people being present. This also makes sense given the far distance of Japan and also the strength of Spain, Mexico and later the United States in the region, and also the UK or Canada in the Seattle sort of region. So we're not going to assume they settle these regions effectively, but it isn't out of the question. In regards to the Philippines, I believe the Japanese would come to a diplomatic agreement with Spain to not invade each other. This makes sense given their Catholic faith they share, and the Spanish-Portuguese direct influence in the conversion of Japan to Christianity. However, during the Spanish-American War of 1898, assuming something similar occurs which is likely in this new timeline, we may see the Japanese purchasing or simply annexing the Philippines to prevent their Pacific rival of America from gaining such a nearby base of operations. Vietnam and the other nations of Indochina were respectably powerful. It was the British and French's industrial technology which allowed them to effectively invade the region. I don't believe the Japanese would be able to beat them to the punch in this area as a result. What about Indonesia? The Dutch had formed the Dutch East India Company in 1602, and alongside a British presence, the Japanese themselves would be unable to colonize the whole region for themselves. The Dutch and later the British will be more aggressive with the added competition with the Japanese. I'd argue the Japanese could take the island of Borneo, or at least a solid portion of it, perhaps combined with some smaller islands. I'd say Java and Sumatra off the table, however. But the region of modern Malaysia would likely be acquired by the Japanese. The British took until the 1800s to conquer the new region in our timeline. I think even if they were a bit earlier with the added competition, they wouldn't beat the Japanese to the area. Due to the heavy presence of malaria in Papua New Guinea, it would not be feasible for the Japanese to colonize the region. Likely the British or Dutch will colonize the region with the advent of modern medical technology, as they did in our timeline, before the Japanese can take it. It's likely the Japanese will reach New Zealand eventually through their island hopping in the Pacific. Due to the large and ferocious native Maori population of the area, the British had to bring a large army and also a large amount of settlers to establish dominance in New Zealand. I'd say the Japanese would take a similar approach. Australia would initially be available for colonisation too, but it would take longer to reach as the Japanese wouldn't control the close islands of Indonesia or Papua New Guinea. I believe the British will eventually kick the Japanese out of Australia. Japan will industrialise and modernise like they did in our timeline, so will remain competitive with European powers in the Pacific. However, if Japan takes sides in potential world wars, they may gain or lose colonies accordingly. Let's assume decolonisation happens in a similar fashion as it did in our timeline after the world wars, as European history would not be drastically altered in this new timeline. I'd expect eventually for New Zealand to become its own nation. Regions such as Korea, Manchuria, the Philippines and parts of Indonesia will become independent as well. However, the Pacific Islands are likely to remain under Japanese control, alongside areas such as Taiwan and the smaller islands like Hokkaido or Sakhalin. After this period of decolonisation, what would Japan look like in this new timeline? I'd say it would be fairly similar to modern Japan in our own timeline, but just with the cultural differences we've previously discussed being embedded into their society. Christianity will be more secularized in modern Japan, like in modern Europe or America in our own timeline, assuming the world follows a similar religious trajectory, which I believe will happen. They will maintain an adversarial dynamic with the Chinese and Koreans, and potentially the Americans. But with the longer duration of colonization without the atrocities of World War II, and also the Christianization of Korea and Manchuria, I don't think the dynamic would be as distasteful and rivalrous as it was in our timeline. They wouldn't hate each other in the way they kind of do in our own timeline. Modern Japan in our own timeline is defined by its rapid industrialization and materialism that sprouted after World War II under the guidance of the US. Because of the more gradual transformation to a capitalist system, you would expect to see more disorganized Japanese cities and such, due to less foresight and planning, like the modern city of Tokyo, which was planned very effectively after World War II. I'd also argue that the hyper-capitalist flavour of Japan is likely to be toned down to be more on par with Western nations due to the more gradual transition into a capitalist society. However, it could be argued that East Asian nations are more prone to a hyper-capitalist society, as we see in modern Korea. The reason I mention modern Korea in our own timeline is that it happens to have a sizable Christian minority of about 23%, showing a bit of Christian influence may not be relevant to this issue. Japan in our own timeline is seen quite fondly by the West. I don't think this is going to change, to be honest, unless America maintains hostile relations due to any unresolved issues with the Pacific Islands. That's about all for this timeline. This was a very fun but also a very difficult video to make, so I hope you enjoyed it. Until next time, this has been History's Influence. Thank you for watching.